Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. For those of you I don't know, I'm Will Sue and one of the steering team members of the Enlightenment Professional Growth and Success Initiative within finance. So on behalf of EPS, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us during this busy time of year to talk about very important topics of diversity and inclusion. I'd also like to thank the Women Across Finance, the Asian Heritage, and South Asian American employee networks for helping us publicize today's event. I'm confident that you will find today's speaker both enlightening and inspiring. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our CFO, Don Mulligan, to make some opening remarks and then briefly introduce today's distinguished guest.
Thanks, Will. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Will and the EPS team for being the primary coordinators of this. I know there was others that were involved, but I want to thank them. For background, EPS is the finance initiative that has the mission of facilitating mutual professional and personal development by fostering cultural and business enlightenment through partnerships that build relationships and dialogues that bridge gaps. That's quite a mouthful. It's quite a mission. It's certainly very aspirational, and they do it tremendously well. We've been doing it for 11 years. We have over 100 junior and senior partners involved in mentoring relationships as we speak. And if you look over the last 11 years, it measures in the several hundreds of people that have been involved. So it's a tremendous effort. My hat's off to Will, who helps lead it with a small group. Let me introduce Valerie, our guest speaker today. It's certainly my pleasure to introduce her. And just kind of to put it in context for me, we talk about it from a General Mills standpoint, but certainly if you look at the United States more broadly, one of the great strengths of our country is our diversity. But I think we also have to recognize that there's been no ethnic group who's come to our country that hasn't faced difficulties. Today's St. Paddy's Day. I have stories from my grandparents who immigrated from Ireland and the prejudice they faced in Boston. But I think it's even more acute when there are physical differences that people can recognize in skin color and in dress. And I think we have to acknowledge that. Certainly as we hear Valerie's story. Valerie's a third-generation Sikh American born and raised in California. That background gave her a very unique view on 9/11 and some of the hate violence that came after that tragedy. I've read a bit about Valerie, and there's a comment that she made that I saw. She actually quoted one of the Sikh central themes or tenets, I guess I would say, that she learned, I think, from your grandfather, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm sure I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, so forgive me. But Namdan Isnan, which means in order to realize God and realize yourself, you must act here and now without fear, which I think is a tremendous sentiment and one that she completely acted upon. She spent more than 5 years creating, writing, and producing the film Divided We Fall, which was the first feature-length documentary about hate violence in America post 9/11. For those of you who have seen the film, you know that it's sobering, it's moving, and it is uplifting, and it really does tell an American story. Since it first premiered in 2006, it's won awards from Toronto to Seattle to Los Angeles, and Valerie has been speaking to audiences across the country, sharing her work and her experiences in making the film. So I am very much looking forward to hearing what she has to say. And without further ado, let me introduce Valerie Carr.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here today. I want to thank the leadership at General Mills, and I want to thank Will Sue in the finance department. And I want to thank all of you to take time out of a very busy afternoon to come and spend some time thinking about diversity and difference. I commend you, and I really look forward to our hour here together. I'm here to talk to you today about fear and fearlessness and authenticity. I have come to believe that we come into the world afraid. Naked and crying out, we are immediately bundled up and soothed. We are wrapped in story. The story of our mother and father, the story of our country and our religion and our society. And by story, I mean a larger narrative that tells us who we are, where we are, and where we are going. The most dominant narrative is a product of power struggles through history that divide the world up, that decides who gets the resources, and that assigns us roles according to our race, our religion, our gender, sexual orientation, according to our class. This narrative gives us scripts to read, tells us who we have power over and who has power over us. And as long as we read this script, in exchange we are given shelter, we are given the promise of order. But what happens? What happens when cracks begin to show in that narrative? What happens when in those dark crevices we glimpse some terrible violence, some unnamed oppression, and we realize that we can't read the script anymore in good conscience? That in fact we are participating in the illusion of shelter, the illusion of order, that something is terribly wrong. And I believe in those moments where doubt stirs in our hearts, where fear begins to rise up in our bodies and our minds, our fear points in a direction. In the direction our fear points, a whirlwind emerges. And in those moments, we have a choice to bury ourselves in comfort and familiarity, no matter what oppression that we end up supporting, or to face that whirlwind and leap into it. I'm standing here before you today to tell you about a decision that I made when the whirlwind first appeared before me. And I'm here to tell you exactly what I learned from jumping in. When I leapt into the whirlwind, I fell hard. I was broken and bruised, cut and bleeding almost literally. But when I fell down in that dark hole, I discovered some kind of freedom, something shining and true. And this is what I want to share with you today. But I have to begin at the beginning, so I'm going to start with my story. And my story begins with sound. ताती वान लगी पार ब्रह्म सुनाई जोगित हमारे राम कार दुख लगे ना पाए सतगुर पूरा पेटिया जिन बंत मनाई राम नाम औख दिया एक कालिव लाई राख लियो तिन रखना हाथ सब यार मटाए को नाने कृपा पे प्रापे सहाय वाहिगुरु जी का खालसा वाहिगुरु जी की फतेह. These are the words that my grandfather used to sing to me as I fell asleep at night. These are the words that he used to recite with me as we drove to school each day. These are the words that I used to hear him hum in the garden in our backyard when I used to follow him as the sun set. These were the words to his favorite prayer of the Guru Granth Sahib, the Sikh holy scriptures. And even though I didn't know what these words meant, I memorized them, because I was sure that these words contained the secret to my grandfather's fearlessness. And he was indeed fearless. He was and is the most fearless person that I know. A tall, dignified Sikh man with a turban and beard. He signed up for the military when he was very young, working for the British Indian Army, fighting in World War II, and he slept soundly during the German air raids. He fought on the front lines in Egypt and Libya. And he talked about how he was so proud that as much as he fought in that war, fought for the right side, that he never killed a man. I imagine my grandfather must have hummed this prayer to himself as he escaped the religious riots that divided India and Pakistan into two, the partition of India in 1947, where he barely escaped those religious riots, where 2 million people were killed, including my great-uncle. And I imagine my grandfather must have hummed these words to himself as he escaped the riots that consumed New Delhi in 1984, where anti-Sikh massacres set the capital of India up in flames. So when I came home from school at night, and the kids and teachers at school would tell me that I would burn in hell because I was not Christian, and I would fall asleep and wake up in a sweat from dreams of hellfire and judgment day, it was these words that I would sing to myself in order to lull myself back to sleep. You see, in those early days, in that very small, conservative hometown in California's Central Valley, under the Reagan era, I grew up wrapped in this narrative, this dominant narrative that our country was a land of freedom. Our country was a tolerant nation made up of immigrants, but our country was a Christian nation. And discrimination in this country was nearly a thing of the past. I think in the eyes of my friends and my teachers who were so adamant that I had to go and save my entire family, otherwise we would face the consequences, when Judgment Day came. I think, in their words, that's when I first began to see the cracks emerge in that dominant narrative. But that narrative would not come crumbling down until September 11th, 2001. I was 20 years old. That's when the whirlwind first appeared before me. And when it appeared, it was these voices I was hearing. And you can play the first clip from the film. My grandfather crossed an ocean to become American. Nearly a century later, I crossed the country to discover what it means to be American. This is a story about my journey.
When it first hit, there was debris, like you're just looking in disbelief. And then the debris starts going everywhere, so you start running. I was south of Trinity Church and west of Trinity Church. So I'm like at the other corner of the World Trade Center. So everyone's thinking to themselves, like, walk east or walk south. And everyone here is thinking, walk east or walk north, right? Because it's the only way to get away from the building.
Right away, you went to...
Right, as soon as the first tower came down, we were like, we're going to be expecting massive casualties and stuff. So then we took off and went down to the other tower.
Then I was on the bridge, and there's people with concrete dust all over them. You know, when you see it burning, and then
we don't have a TV. What? He was the towers. A plane just flew into the towers, and he was, you know, he was just like talking, and I wasn't processing it, and I kind of hung up on him.
I thought we were going to be called out in a large way. It was the hate crimes unit. I knew right away that there was going to be retaliation.
World Trade Center's attacked. I went to work, and I was kind of worried. You know, the next day, should I go to work? But I had a double worry. I had to worry about somebody hurting me on the subway. I shouldn't have to worry about that.
The phone rings. He said, your dad's been shot. He was wearing a white turban and a beard, and, you know, he was an enemy. So that's the only, I feel like that's the only reason that they really shot him.
I was saying, why did you do that? His exact words were, because you're a white nigger lover and your friend's an Arabic asshole.
When 4 guys came in and they asked the clerk, who was Mexican, is this store owned by Palestinians? She's all, no, it's by Indians. They're like, same thing. They broke the windows, knocked down shelves.
My husband grew up in India. He had no idea what's about to happen. The minute I saw what happened, I told him, Sikhs are in for a hard time, be prepared.
Well, yeah, anybody could be a target.
You told me to go home, right?
Yeah, basically, I don't care where you're at.
You know, there's a lot of backlash. He said to me, well, what do you expect? You expect people to come around and give you roses?
I remember this guy came up to me. He was like, you know, you're a cute terrorist.
We're the bad people. We're the people who committed this horrendous act.
Some people say I'm from Afghanistan and I'm Bin Laden's son.
I can put a face to what hate really means.
Can I be as free or as open as I want to be?
You're afraid to leave your own home.
Inequality, injustice, intolerance. Terrorists. Go back to your country.
Hatred. I was scared.
Just kind of paranoid.
You're guilty unless you're proven innocent.
Everyone in this country did turban equals terrorist.
And justice will be done.
And thanks for joining us. We want to get you caught up on today's developments from Tuesday's terrorist attacks.
But first, we have some breaking news to tell you about. I'm at a Mesa gas station near 80th Street and University. An employee was shot and killed. You can see behind me, police are still on the scene investigating.
1 man is dead. The targets are these 3 locations: 2 gas stations and a private home in Mesa.
You've seen the patrol cars before, you've seen the crime tape and the detectives at the scene. But when you see the family and friends arrive, you start to understand there may be something different about the murder of Balbir Singh. He is a native of India, a follower of the Sikh religion.
His family has also been targeted by people who've mistaken him for being an Arab. Now, police, on the other hand, are not confirming if this was indeed a hate crime. They'll only say the victim was outside the gas station when a truck came by and fired several shots and the victim was killed.
Next thing you know, everything's blocked off and, you know, people are crying and my heart goes out to them so much.
I don't know, it's just sickening. There's no excuse for that.
suspect is 42 years old. He is from Mesa, and his name is Frank Roque.
When I set out across the country, I was looking for the heart of America. I went through many cities and many stories until I finally found it, halfway around the world, at her doorstep, all along. My name is Valerie. I am an American. I am a Sikh. I am a student, away at school, living in my books. All day long I read about ethics, religion, violence, law. It can get a little depressing, reading about all the reasons why people kill each other. I guess that's why I can't let myself forget what I learned on the road, which I'll tell you in a moment. But first, when September 11th happened, I was crumpled on the floor of my parents' bedroom watching the towers fall over and over again between a picture of a man with a turban and beard. It wasn't long before I realized that America's new enemy looked like my family, looked like my uncles, looked like my grandfather when he was younger. But I did not break from that paralysis until I heard the story of Balbir Singh Sodhi. Because he was someone my family knew, it was as if an uncle had been murdered, and when his news, the news of his murder did not make primetime news that evening, it felt as if the dominant narrative had squeezed out stories that had so much at stake. And you know what I did? I did something quite heroic. I ran to my bedroom, I locked the door, and I hid for days. And I turned to my bookshelf, and here, you know, I'm a Stanford student, all these great degrees, right? I study religion and international relations, and I had all of these great texts from history lined up on my bookshelf, from the Bible to the Quran to the Guru Granth Sahib. And do you know what text I pulled down to comfort me? Can anyone guess? The text of our generation? I pulled down Harry Potter. I pulled down Harry Potter, and I read all of that. At that time, there were only 3. I read all 3 Harry Potter books, and I realized that I preferred the black and white world in those fantasy novels of Harry versus Voldemort, good versus evil, compared to the complexity outside my bedroom window where Americans were killing Americans. A gray whirlwind had appeared there, and I did not want to face it, and I probably would have been stuck there in Hogwarts unless I heard the stories of my grandfather, the stories of partition, the stories of '84, these stories that were never in my California history book. And I realized that what was happening to my community right now would go unremembered, lost forever unless someone chronicled these stories. And that's when I had this idea to go do this. And as soon as I had that idea, I was flooded by 1,000 doubts. I was only 20, I had no degree yet, I had no film experience. I'm third-generation American, Sikh American. I've always felt like an outsider to my own community. Why would they trust me with their stories? And all of these doubts created this gulf of fear before me, this gulf that I just could not cross alone until I heard the words of my grandfather. In order to realize yourself, in order to realize God, you must act here and now without fear. And so I turned to the whirlwind and I leapt into it. I grabbed my camera, I grabbed my cousin, he had an old beat-up car, I had a list of questions. We got in the car and we drove across the country for weeks, for months, into a journey that would change the course of my life. We went from coast to coast through the South and Midwest, and some of you have seen the film. Could raise your hands if you've seen it. Ah, that's wonderful. So you know what the journey disclosed. I'm just going to share with you a few moments that you may not have caught in the film, a few snapshots and sound bites from my notes on Into the Whirlwind. I'm in New York. I am standing at Ground Zero, and the rubble is still smoldering, the smoke lifting up to the air as it rains. And I'm standing next to a 30-year-old man, thick Brooklyn accent, a Sikh American, turban and beard. And he's telling me about how he ran from the towers that morning with thousands of other people. He stopped to catch his breath when a group of men across the street pointed at him, yelled at him, "Hey, you effing terrorist, take that turban off." And he found himself running for his life the second time in 15 minutes. For those of you who've seen the film, you know that Amrik Singh Javla escaped the mob who chased him. What you may not realize is that they chased him even before bin Laden's face was up on the television set. In Queens, New York, I am in a small bedroom, and there's a mattress on the floor, and there's light streaming through the window, and on this mattress is an old man who looks like my grandfather. Vaheguru, Vaheguru, he says over and over again, God's name. A few hours after September 11th, he had walked out of the Sikh Gurdwara, a house of worship, where he had been praying for those who had died, when a group of kids beat him with baseball bats. And when I saw him, he still couldn't move. A few months after I'd interviewed him, he died. I am in San Jose. And in San Jose, there's a small Muslim boy. His name is Samir. And Samir was one of my favorite people to interview. He was a kid with so much spunk, and he talked about how the kids at school take their lunch pills and smash them in his face and so that he can't breathe. And he says over and over again, I'm a good guy, I'm a good guy, I'm not a bad guy, I'm not a bad guy. I say, okay, Samir, you're not a bad guy, you're a good guy. And he says, and if I saw the bad guys, I would beat them up with my karate. And I say, okay, Samir. And then I say, well, how will you know if they're the bad guys? And this little 7-year-old boy says, oh, they'll have turbans on their heads. Hundreds of stories like this, thousands of stories like this. The FBI reported that hate crimes after September 11th increased by 1,600%. That's a conservative estimate. Hate crimes against Muslims or those who looked Muslim. Organizations reported that thousands of hate incidents had taken place, and Balbir Singh Sodhi was only one of more than 22 people killed in the year-long aftermath of those attacks. But when I say Matthew Shepard, when I say James Byrd, people know these names. When I say Balbir Singh Sodhi, they ask, is that a terrorism suspect? Even now, almost 9 years later, these stories, their names, are still not fully understood. And so I think that what I want to share with you now is the moment where I actually went to Phoenix and sat with the Sodhi family and what they taught me. I'll play the second clip, please.
First, we have some developments in an attack that happened right here in the valley.
Involves a member of the Sikh community.
Very well be the country's first deadly act of misplaced revenge to Tuesday's attack
killed in
on
yesterday's
America.
shooting immigrated to the U.S. and Phoenix looking for a better life.
Suspected hate crime right here in the valley.
A Mesa gas station owner was gunned down in cold blood by a man who may have targeted him because he was wearing a turban.
News of the violence shocked
Balbir
Mesa.
Singh Sodhi was well known and well liked in the neighborhood surrounding his convenience store.
I'm ashamed that this was the first state to show ignorance and stupidity.
We drove long hours through a desert. The desert turned into a city, and there, a gas station. There were still flowers near the Chevron sign where it happened.
People were putting the landscaping that day. My brother talking to the landscaping guys. Somebody bring their car behind my brother and shoot 5 times in the back.
He went with us to drop us at the airport. He said, I want to spend more time with my children. And that's the last time I saw him at the airport. It's over, he's no more. And that's just like a terrible moment of my life. I mean, I couldn't believe that.
One hour before his death, he went to Costco and gave $74 to the New Year victims. Whatever in his pocket, he gave all his money to the New Year victims. 1 hour before his death. He called me about 2 o'clock and he said, bring me a couple of American flags. I want to put on the store.
Media people come to me and ask me, what are you feeling about the Americans? I said, why you ask me this question? Why you not think we are American? Why you put those 2 words to separate? Because we are American also.
I was scared though, but when I heard it, and then I was like freaking out. I'm like, what the heck is going on?
The thing that stands out the most to me on that day, right after the shootings occurred, when me and my wife went down to be with the Sikh community, is looking into the faces of the children and to realize what must be going on in their minds. And so together, as the Arizona Interfaith Movement, we really are committed to stand against hate and intolerance.
During this High Holy Day season for Jews, when we are compelled by our tradition to look within, to search our souls, and to determine what our future will be, I thought it was important to be with the members of the Sikh community this morning.
The guilt by association is not a right thing. Racism is not right. Prejudices are not right. We have to eliminate prejudices. We have to eliminate the hate. We have to bring love, peace, and harmony.
Being a Christian, I really feel like God will always bring something good out of a tragedy anyway, so.
This is condolence letters, just some of the condolence letters to the community and to the family. And this one, it says, a few days ago, I read in horror about what happened to Mr. Sodi. I choked back tears as I read that Mr. Sodi has tried to find a flag to fly at his business. With this letter, I have sent 2 items which are priceless to me. This flag was used to honor my father at his funeral. He served in the U.S. Army for 21 years. During this time, he worked as a medic in Korea and during 2 rotations in Vietnam. In my eyes, your father deserves his flags as much as any soldier. He had courage to go to work in spite of the danger imposed by the ignorance of others. He was good and he was kind, and in my opinion, he served our country as faithfully as my father. Isn't that beautiful?
It's always tough. You can't forget your family member is gone, and life is very tough without. This should not be happening anymore to anybody.
It was after that interview that the inevitable happened. The camera spun 180 degrees on me and my cousin as people began to tell us to go back home, to go back to our country. People began to flip us off on the road. And it was the first time in my life, being a 20-year-old kid, that I fully saw myself through the eyes of other people who saw me as foreign, as suspect, as not American. And as the years drew on, And I realized that this hate violence wasn't something that was going to just happen once and go away, that a permanent shift had happened in our country and in our communities, where now we have Sikh and Muslim and Arab American kids who are growing up not in the shadow of September 11th, but in the shadow of the face of Osama bin Laden. Samir, at the end of the film, if you remember, after several years, I asked him, the kids at school, do they tease you anymore? He says, no, they don't call me bin Laden anymore. They call me Saddam Hussein. The names change, and yet the reality stays the same for these kids who have never remembered a time before September 11th. And I noticed that every time there is another terrorist attack abroad, whether it's Madrid or London, every time there's a critical moment in the fight against terrorism, every time a terrorism suspect is apprehended, whether it's a Christmas Day bomber or the Fort Hood shooter, advisories go out in the Sikh and Muslim and Arab communities telling people to be careful, stay inside, watch your back. It's not just extra searches at the airport anymore. It's a permanent lost sense of belonging where we have to fight for the need to be seen the way that we see ourselves. I think the darkest moment for me came when I was writing my honors thesis about all of these stories. I was writing about something called Stereotype Threat, this idea that stereotypes are embedded in our social landscape and we can't help but respond to them even if we don't endorse them. And as I was writing my honors thesis, I was thinking, yes, I need to go out and tell people about the racism that they don't know about that lives inside of their own bodies and hearts. Certainly I am free of such racism. You can imagine what happens next. I am walking home from school that day, and an African-American man is approaching me on the street. And I cross the street, and I pull my bag closer, and my stomach tightens. And for the first time in my life, I ask myself, why is my body responding this way before my mind has even said a word? And I thought back to when I was a kid, and I watched all those episodes of Cops, where the bad guy is always this young African-American male, and how even though I had friendships and I was educated, that those images were so powerful, so in the air, that my body couldn't help but absorb them. I had been wired by them. In Omaha, Nebraska, an old woman came up to me in a church after I showed the film and said, Valerie, after 9/11, I saw two turbaned men in an airport and I got scared. And I just want to tell you that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for being scared. And I was just about to accept her apology when I realized, wait a second, I have done this. That we all have done this. That we're all guilty, that our guilt should just cancel out because it's not the first moment that we have responsibility over. It's the second moment, because in that second moment we can give in to the way that we've been wired, or we can notice what's happening to us, what script has been written into us, and draw upon other faces and other voices and other stories to undo what's already been done. At that moment, though, I didn't know all of this. I just felt that, my God, I too can feel the racist inside of me. It was a dark moment, and that's when I fell. When you leap into the whirlwind, you fall. I had fallen hard. Not only had I taken in the trauma of what I saw after September 11th, but I had lost all hope that we have the power to choose another script, to undo how we've been constructed. And I would have stayed there. I would have stayed there in that darkness if it wasn't for the last interview that I did. And you can play the last clip.
There was one last person I hadn't talked to. I boarded a plane to India to find the widow of Bulbir Sodhi. It was a long journey. Once we landed in New Delhi, we drove for 9 hours to Punjab. And then down a long dirt road through endless fields. And in these fields, a village. And in this village, a house. And she was there, dressed in white, the color of morning. There were dark circles under her eyes. She would begin to cry at just the mention of his name. How could I ask her anything?
Sorry, कहते हैं बहुत हुआ इन्ना ना हुआ सब कुछ हुआ पर मन नहीं चलता मैंने तो कुछ नहीं मिला मैं तो सब कुछ खाली लगता कुछ नहीं चलता बच्चे रोंदे कुड़ियां वेखियां नहीं जांदियां निके निके बच्चे है जड़े ਹੁਣ ਤਾਂ ਬਿਲਕੁਲ ਤਿਆਰ ਸੀਗੇ 10 ਨਵੰਬਰ ਦੀ ਟਿਕਟ ਸੀਗੀ ਮੇਰਾ ਆਪਣੇ 2 ਮਹੀਨੇ ਨਹੀਂ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਦਿੱਤੇ ਮਿਲਣ ਵਿਛੜੇ ਹੀ ਰਹਿ ਗਏ ਉਹਦੀ ਇੰਨਾ ਯਾਦ ਕਰੀਦਾ ਕਿ ਸੁਪਨੇ 'ਚ ਕੋਈ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਨ ਕੁਝ ਨਹੀਂ
ਇਹ ਰੀਜ਼ਨ ਮੈਂ ਇੱਥੇ ਆਉਣਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੀ ਸੀ ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਦੱਸ ਸਕਦੀ ਹਾਂ
ਬਹੁਤ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੇ ਮਨਾਂ 'ਚ ਬਹੁਤ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਰਿਸਪੈਕਟ ਤੇ ਪਿਆਰ ਸੀ
ਨਹੀਂ ਇਹ ਦੇਖ ਕੇ ਤਾਂ ਲੱਗਦਾ ਹੀ ਹੈ ਵੀ ਚੱਲ ਨਾ ਆਪਣਾ ਬਣਾ ਕੇ ਜਾਣਾ ਤਾਂ ਸਭ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈ ਇਹ ਸੀਗਾ ਵੀ ਚੱਲ ਬੱਚਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਇੱਕ ਵਾਰੀ ਮਿਲ ਲੈਂਦੇ ਘਰ ਇੱਕ ਵਾਰੀ ਆ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਫਿਰ ਬਹੁਤ ਤੜਫ ਨਾ ਲੱਗਦੀ ਜਾਣਾ ਤਾਂ ਜਾਣਾ ਹੀ ਹੈ ਸਭ ਨੇ ਜਾਣਾ
ਜਦੋਂ ਇਨਸਾਨ ਟਾਈਮ ਤੋਂ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਚਲਾ ਜਾਂਦਾ
ਫਿਰ ਬੜਾ ਦੁੱਖ ਹੁੰਦਾ
So many American people are going to see.
I managed only one question. What would you tell the people of America? I was expecting anger, bitterness, regret, something that matched the despair I was beginning to feel.
ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਦੁੱਖ ਦਰਦ ਨੂੰ ਸਮਝਣਗੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਕੁਝ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੇ
ਨਹੀਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਤਾਂ ਜੋ ਪਿਆਰ ਵਿਖਾਇਆ ਮੈਂ ਕਦੀ ਭੁੱਲ ਵੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਸਕਦੀ ਮੈਂ ਵੀ ਕਈ ਸਾਲਾਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਗਏ ਸੀਗੇ ਜੋ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਪਿਆਰ ਵਿਖਾਇਆ ਉਹ ਤਾਂ ਨਹੀਂ ਮੈਂ ਭੁੱਲ ਸਕਦੀ ਪਰ ਇਹ ਆ ਵੀ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਆਪਣੇ ਮਨ ਨੂੰ ਠੇਸ ਲੱਗੀ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਨਹੀਂ ਭੁੱਲ ਸਕਦੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਜੋ ਕੀਤਾ ਜਿੰਨਾ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਉਹ ਤੋਂ ਵੱਧ ਕੀ ਕੀਤਾ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਬਹੁਤ ਪਿਆਰ ਕੀਤਾ ਵਾਪਸ ਨਹੀਂ ਸੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਹੱਥ 'ਚ ਨਹੀਂ ਸੀ ਲਿਆ ਸਕਦੇ ਬਾਕੀ ਆਪਣਾ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਸਾਰੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਪਿਆਰ ਵਿਖਾਇਆ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੇ ਕੋਈ ਜਾਤ ਨਹੀਂ ਕੋਈ ਬਰਾਦਰੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਕੁਛ ਨਹੀਂ ਉੱਥੇ ਵੇਖਿਆ ਸਭ ਇਕੱਠੇ ਸੀਗੇ ਹਿੰਦੂ ਮੁਸਲਮਾਨ ਸਾਰੇ ਕ੍ਰਿਸਚਨ ਸਭ ਮੈਂ ਕਿਹਾ ਉੱਥੇ ਸਭ ਰੋਂਦੇ ਸੀ ਇਹ ਗੱਲੇ ਨੇ ਵੀ ਆਪਣੇ ਸਿੱਖ ਹੀ ਰੋਂਦੇ ਸੀ ਸਭ ਰੋਂਦੇ ਸੀ ਬੱਚਿਆਂ ਨੇ ਨਿੱਕੇ ਨੇ ਕਿੱਦਾਂ ਕਾਰਾਂ ਵਾਸ਼ ਕਰਕੇ ਕਿੱਦਾਂ ਡੋਨੇਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਕੇ ਪਿਆਰ ਹੀ ਸੀ ਬੱਚਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ
ਪਿਆਰ ਔਰ ਇਹ ਪਿਆਰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਅਰਨ ਕੀਤਾ
ਸੀ
Okay, ਸਤਿ ਸ਼੍ਰੀ ਅਕਾਲ
This was the heart of America, the one that lived in her memory. The heart of America is found in the spaces where people have come together for just a moment and left a trace. Places like Mesa and Phoenix, where hundreds spontaneously gathered at the Sodi gas station to pray and mourn throughout the night, throughout the days and weeks that followed.
This crime has really awakened the community.
I've never seen a memorial grow so quickly.
People have been coming out here to the crime scene non-stop.
Trying to take home a lesson.
We just live 3 miles that way, and we'll do anything that we can to help.
Family says it couldn't and would not have reopened had it not been for the huge show of support from their customers and their friends.
Thousands came to the memorial. One human being's story brought together an entire city. Stories can change how we see, Stories can break down the wall, dividing us from them. It was the widow's words that saved me. It was her forgiveness, her capacity to stop a cycle of violence, and for her to receive the love that she did receive in Phoenix. And I realized that what happened in Phoenix is a testament to what is possible for the nation. Balbir Singh Sodhi's story was not told on national news, but the local Sikh community did know how to communicate his story to local news. And as a result, those 3,000 people who came, they didn't know who he was. They had never heard the word Sikh before, many of them. And yet they came out in the thousands because they heard his story, because they understood that he had left India to escape religious persecution, that he would never see the eyes of his grandchildren, that his widow's heart was now broken. It was a story that enabled them to come, that enabled her to forgive. It was her words that inspired me to keep going and finish the film, believe in the power of the story of this film. And as a result, I've been all across the country and have witnessed something remarkable. In 150 cities and audiences just as diverse as this, a man in New York stands up and says, just as I have to fight for gays to come out of the closet, I am gay. I have to fight for the right for Sikhs to wear their turbans. In Chicago, a black man stood up and he said, pointing to his braids, my braids are my turban. In the Deep South, when I was anticipating resistance, and there was a white Southern man, evangelical, who was combative in the Q&A, he came up to me afterwards and he says, Valerie, you know, you and I we're not that much different. We have something in common. I said, what's that? I too have been seen as an outsider. Hundreds of voices like this, thousands of voices like this, voices that have helped me get a glimpse into the heart of the American people and realize that we all have a stake at expanding the circle of who counts as one of us. That all of us at some time, even the white middle-class male who thinks that he's only led a life of privilege and can't relate to diversity, at some point has fallen outside of the mainstream. That perhaps the one thing that connects all of us is that we all have been outsiders. Even those of us who have ancestors who have come on the Mayflower, they were escaping religious persecution. Whether we have Native American ancestry here, who were then seen as outsiders on their own land, whether we were here bringing the immigrant experience with us, perhaps the one thing we all have in common is in our histories and in our bodies and our lives, we all have been outsiders at some point. And we all have this shared desire to be seen the way that we see ourselves. And that this should be the starting point. This should be the starting point when we talk about diversity. It's not about a bunch of people over here. We need to recognize it. In fact, that we all have something at stake is the starting point. And then we can talk about historical oppression and structural racism, once we understand that we're all in this together. And when we understand that, miracles can happen. My Punjabi language professor, turban, beard, thick Punjabi accent, also reminds me of my grandfather. After 9/11, 3 different things happened to him. The first time, a bunch of kids threw skateboards at him, and he and his wife barely got away. The second time he was on a train, and someone was yelling profanities at him, and he got off that train. The third time was different. The third time, my professor is sitting on this bus, looking out the window, when a white man at the front of the bus stood up, turned around, red in the face, pointed at my professor and started yelling at him, "Hey, you effing terrorist, get off this bus, go back to your country, go back to where you belong," spewing profanities. And my professor does what he has learned to do. He stays quiet, keeps looking out the window, prays for the moment to pass. At that moment, something remarkable happened. A miracle happened. The other people on the bus began to stand up.
the white woman, the black kid, the Asian girl, they all stood up and they took this man's arm and they said, sit down, be quiet, you don't know what you're saying, sit down. And the man sits down. The bus comes to a stop, and my professor gets off this bus, and the man gets off this bus, and the man comes up to my professor and puts out his arm, and at this point, my stomach is tight, I'm ready to cry, I know this moment. I'm waiting for the violence to happen. But the man takes my professor's hand and shakes it and says, my granddaughter was just killed on that second plane that went into that second tower. I'm angry. I'm sorry. And what has stayed with me about that story is not necessarily the man's transformation, because that's powerful in itself. What has stayed with me about that story are the people on that bus. I look out at all of you and I realize that we are the people on that bus. We are the people who can stand up in the most ordinary of circumstances and say and do the most extraordinary things to fight for the kind of country, the kind of community, and the kind of company that we believe in, that we want to see. That these whirlwinds I speak of, they're not huge, gigantic whirlwinds all the time. It doesn't mean leaving your life as you know it and leaping into the whirlwind and changing your career and making a film. That a whirlwind can appear at any point in the day. They can be tiny. That it's whenever you have a choice of whether to read the script, the narrative of power that you've been given, the narrative that tells you, the script that tells you not to reach out to that colleague in that other cubicle. The script that tells you, you know, you're a minority, don't make waves. The script that tells you, you know, you're privileged, you don't have to question the racial and gender distribution in this company or in this country. Those scripts offer us protection, they offer us order, they offer us shelter. But those narratives, they can also become our prisons. That I promise you, if you break from that script in the tiniest of ways, if you stand up on that bus, if you face that whirlwind and decide to leap into it, that is where you find freedom. Just over a year ago, my grandfather died, and I had to speak at his funeral. This casket was behind me. It was open, and I could see his beautiful regal turban and his beard and his dead body, and I had to stand in front of that body and speak. And I was afraid. And I decided that what I would do is I would finally figure out what that prayer he taught me when I was a kid meant. So I found out. And this is what it means. The hot winds cannot touch me. I am sheltered by the divine. On all four sides, I am shielded by the divine. Sorrow cannot consume me. I have met the true and perfect one who created all of this. I am healed in Ram's name. I am merged with the one. The keeper has kept me and taken away what ails me. Nanak says, grace has fallen upon me, and the divine has come to my side. The hot winds cannot touch me. The hot winds cannot touch me. Tati vana lagi, para brahma sharnai, jogid hamare ram kar, dukh lage na pai. The hot winds cannot touch me. I'm standing here before you this afternoon to tell you that if you leap into that whirlwind, you will fall, you will break, you might even cut and bleed. But I promise you that the hot winds cannot touch you if you have truth or justice or love in your heart. And I promise you that you will find freedom. Because what is freedom other than a surrender to truth and justice and love. So what I ask you to do today is something very small, is to think about the whirlwinds that you have left in your own life, whether they be small or large, and turn to just one of your colleagues today, this week, and tell them your own story about how you leapt into the whirlwind and what you learned, because just maybe finding your freedom will inspire other people to find their freedom too. Thank you.
We have a couple minutes for a question and answer if anyone has any questions. We do ask that you use the microphone because we are recording questions and answers as well.
And I'll just say, as the Q&A goes on, there are two things that'll be passed out. One is a postcard of the film. If you wanted to buy it, it's on Amazon and Netflix. And the other is really important to me. These are blank responses for your own stories, your own reflections, your own thoughts if you want to share them. They're posted anonymously on our website. And yours will be the first certainly from General Mills. Your questions, your thoughts, your reactions.
Oh, my name is Julia. I'd just like to thank you and compliment you. You're right on. What you shared with us is the essence of a human being. And once you've been touched by that, it not leave you ever. It germinates, the seed is in you, and it gets bigger. Thank you very much again. Oh, now it works.
Thank you so much. And your name?
My name's Ken Titcomb, but very powerful film, and I really enjoyed your message. Well, it's so fast forward. It's been 9 years. Can you talk a little bit about your journey over the years since your film was finished?
It has been 9 years, and what has surprised me is just how relevant the film continues to be. That we've now traveled in the last 3 years to 150 cities around the country and around the world, and I noticed that even, it's a very American film. It's supposed to address an American audience, and it goes back to your comment that you made about how it goes back to the essence of being human. That whether I'm in Australia or Germany or France or Canada, it seems that this struggle of how we live together harmoniously and find within ourselves the courage to leap in a culture of fear, that still seems to be incredibly relevant. And what I find now, I speak a lot about my generation. I call us the shadow generation, a generation that has come of age in the shadow of September 11th. And even into the Obama era, we see that we are still marked by that event and how our country chose to respond. And even now, as change ends up being a lot harder and slower than we all thought, I return to the power of storytelling to change our social consciousness, to put pressure on those legal and political institutions to do right by us, whether it's healthcare, whether it's the war, whether it's hate crimes. So personally, right now, I'm in law school, and I'm beginning to try to figure out how to wield the law as sword and shield. But sitting in that law school classroom, I'm telling you, it's like a fighting ring. It's not about deep dialogue. It's about winning your opponent over with an argument. And that's really important when you're in the Senate, you're on Capitol Hill. But I have come to recognize that what I want to happen is the fighting ring ought to melt into a circle around a fire where we tell each other stories that actually change us from the inside. So on the one hand, I think that what is needed now as our country moves forward is the kind of legal, political cunning, people picking up that sword and shield and knowing how to fight when it's necessary. But the deeper, longer-lasting change comes through the stories that we tell each other, changing social consciousness, expanding that circle of who we count as human, who we count as one of us, who we count as American, so we can have more humane laws. So we don't have something like Guantanamo. So we don't have the secret roundups that we had. So we don't have these wars that go on unnecessarily. So we can apply pressure on the decision makers to do right. So I'm seeing change in both areas are necessary, and this is why I think, coming out and speaking to people on the ground, what you do in this company, what you do in this community matters. How you stand up really matters. It changes culture, and it's long, it's slow, it's not measurable, but I think this is the only way we can kind of change the way that our country is moving. I think maybe one more question.
One of the pieces that stuck out in the movie to me was the Caucasian woman who was on a bus or train and had that fear, same as what you were talking about. I was wondering how she came to her own realization of that kind of racism that she had, and how did you find her?
It's a very good question, and it's a great story. I was a senior at Stanford when the war began in Iraq, and I wasn't going to go to the protest that day. I was feeling very tired and hopeless, but something in me called me to go, and I went, and someone handed me the mic, and I found myself telling stories about what I found on the road and saying, if we have this war, hate violence is going to increase. Racism is going to increase here at home. This is what we saw after 9/11. This is what's going to happen again and again. And it did happen, but one of the women in the audience was Rachel Newman, who was a fellow classmate. And she said, my God, I was sitting behind that man who was arrested, but I told myself this story that made it so that he had to have been guilty. He had to have been guilty. And it wasn't until we sat down with each other and I told her his full story that she was able to confront the sort of prejudice that lived inside of her own fear. And she forgave, she asked for forgiveness, and then I went to Cher Singh, and he forgave her. So my story, like in the words of the widow, and the words of Rachel and Cher, comes back to forgiveness. Like that's how we can break these cycles. And I do think that hearing Rachel's courage of admitting the fear that she found inside of herself, the racism that existed within her, also gave me the courage to go a little deeper, to figure out how we have all been wired, and to confess it, to own it, so that we can let it go. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thanks again, Valerie. For those of you who do have comment cards, we will be collecting them at the end. If you want to write your comments or don't have a pen and want to get them through me, I can then pass them on to Valerie. So again, Will, last name is HSU, via internal mail, and I will forward them on to Valerie and her team. Otherwise, take a minute now, write out your comment cards, and then we'll collect them as you exit. Thanks for coming.
At the bottom of those cards, there's a space with your email address. And for those of you who are interested in what happens next with the film and with this movement, just share your email address, and we'll send you an email once every 3 months to let you know what's happening. We're also on Facebook. The film's on Amazon and on Netflix. But sharing email is probably the best way to keep in touch.
Thank you for coming.